Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this third edition of the Friday Frontiers programme, part of the in-house webinar series that we're running here in DARIAH. My name's Vicky Garnett. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the DARIAH Training and Education Officer. And I'm delighted to welcome for our December edition of Friday Frontiers, Kevin O'Connor and Jonny Johnston from the Academic Practice Unit at Trinity College Dublin. And they're going to talk to us about flipped classrooms. So without further ado, I shall hand over to them.
So hi everyone, thank you very much for having us. My name is Jonny. I work as an academic developer in Trinity Centre for Academic Practice. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Kevin, who's our learning technologist from our e-learning team in IT services.
Morning.
And just in terms of today's session, what we're going to briefly run through, we're going to introduce ourselves. I'm going to run through some of the theory and practice of flipping. What do we mean by the flipped classroom? Give an example of how we're using it at Trinity in a staff education, a staff upskilling mode, for introducing people to theories of teaching and learning. And then Kevin going to talk about a second case study, again, flipping in a professional development context. The two of us, plus a very brief kind of plenary, will take probably 40 minutes, maybe 45 at the most, and then we'll open it up for a general discussion, a more interactive Q&A style. And past experience tells me that the Q&A bit where you are not recorded is probably going to be the most vibrant part of the session. So we have done our best to keep our inputs short, focused, and we hope relevant to yourselves. In terms of professional background, I'm going to briefly speak and then hand over to Kevin for just a minute. I work in a teaching and learning focused part of the university. I come from a research background in post-colonial literature. I've had a very strong interest in teaching and learning for a very long time, and a former career in secondary education. I now work in a higher education model with particular interests in teaching and learning enhancement and staff development, introducing staff to active learning, focusing on theories and practice of assessment, curriculum development, curriculum design, and intercultural education. Kevin, you're up.
Morning, everyone. My name is Kevin O'Connor, and I work as a learning technologist in IT services. I've been in the role just over 6 years, and before that worked with Jonny in academic practice. So my areas, as you can see there, are around virtual learning environment adoption, virtual classrooms, and professional development. I suppose those have certainly kept us busy the last 9 months. It was always a challenge getting people to use the VLE up until about March, and then we obviously had a huge spike in adoption, and it's been trying to adapt everything to keep things going. But apart from that, also research areas around the flipped classroom and video production, which we'll touch on today as well.
Super, thanks Kevin. And again, just to flag that we're going to be keeping a gloss in the chat of any jargon that we're using. I don't think any of it is particularly jargony, but as is always the problem, you don't recognize your own jargon when you use it day in, day out. So feel free to throw anything into the chat box on the way through. So I suppose really before we go any further, if we could get from you, type in the box to drop the number in. How comfortable are you with the concept of the flipped classroom before we go any further? You can just stick a number into the chat box, whether it's 1, very comfortable, 2, comfortable, 3, borderline, or 4, not at all comfortable. Just drop a number in and just to get a sense. Okay, thank you. So that's quite a mix. That's what I would have expected. So thank you very much. I think most people are falling somewhere between comfortable and borderline. Hopefully by the end of the session, more of you should be in the kind of 2, maybe even bordering into the 1 area. So that's just good for us to be able to get a sense really before we go any further about how much detail to go into. Okay, if you haven't heard of flipping before, flipping is quite often presented as a marvelously new idea. It's not. Flipping actually has been around for at least 100 years. What happens in a flipped classroom is that students are provided with information in advance, they prepare it, and then they do something with it during the classroom time. And this really comes back to how you view teaching and learning and what is the purpose of your time with students. Quite often when we think and how we conceive teaching and learning in an institution, we think about lectures where it tends to be an academic who presents content. That time is used really for information transfer. That's very often contrasted with small group interactive teaching, tutorial style. And what happens certainly at many very kind of elite institutions is incredibly small group tutorial, one-on-one teaching, two-on-one teaching, that perhaps is more common now at postgraduate level, whether at research or top program levels. How that model works is that students are presented with a task in advance, something to do for that week. They prepare it. In an Oxbridge model, that's typically an essay, a 1,500 word essay, where the students have to identify key materials from what they're presented, summarize it, write it through, and then they have that assessment engaged with during the session by an expert. The preparation touches on the idea of that assessment as learning, doing it for the learning purposes. The use and the discussion of it is used for feed forward, and then that informs final summative assessment work that happens later in the semester or later in the academic year. That is not possible under normal circumstances and without digital technology in a normal environment. For staffing reasons, and I'm quite sure that many of you are going to smile and sympathize with this, it's just not feasible for the vast majority of us, particularly not in an era of mass higher education. What we do when we talk about flipping is taking that principle of small group tutorial preparation that is engaged with by the academic in a small group model, and we try to scale that and make it doable at lecture level. And the idea behind it really is that flipping gives you, or gives students, as much as is possible, that sense of tutorial in a lecture context. And whether you might view that as a webinar or whether you might view that interactive web event as a lectorial, which can be done either in face-to-face teaching, virtually, synchronous teaching, either face-to-face in person or face-to-face virtually. There's a few bits and pieces that go with that. Flipping quite often does not mean that we're going to substitute lectures with robots or AI chatbots. Flipping shouldn't increase student workload. Flipping, and this is particularly important in an era of COVID, does not mean that lectures pre-record hour-long or 2 hour-long lectures that students then probably won't watch. It also doesn't mean that everything in a flip has to be video based. We quite often, when we read about, when you engage with the literature of flipping, you see it framed as 10-minute videos that students have to watch in advance, complete a quiz, and then that information is drawn on in the session. It doesn't need to be flipped multimedia material, although it often is. There's nothing that says you can't flip traditional academic materials, journal articles, equations, clinical casework. That advanced preparation can also be flipped to be engaged with in the session. For it to work, there needs to be very clear links visible between the flip, the content, the material provided, and what is done with that material in class. And again, familiar to everyone at this stage from a COVID context, we all know that when we're involved in teaching and learning online, everything needs to be much more explicit. Students need very clear guidelines on how they are expected to engage with the flip, with the content that's provided. And this last sentence kind of that I'm speaking to, I know is a bit jargony. I'm sure that, again, I don't think I'm breaking any trade secrets when I say many of us think students do as little as possible to get by, certainly at various points of the year, to encourage that engagement with the flip. How do you know, how do you encourage students that they should actually watch it? Otherwise, how is it different from just handing someone 10 journal articles in week 3, telling them, read this by week 5, and shrugging whether or not they've done it? And the answer is that to hook your engagement, to check that students are doing that, flipping requires you to plan in check-ins, what I would describe as formative assessment techniques with the content that has been provided to them throughout the program, so that they do something and you follow up on it. You address the flip, you wrap it into your materials during the session. There's lots of reasons why you might come against resistance to flipping. From staff, certainly, it takes time to prepare. And this was perhaps less of an issue for prior to COVID, when familiarity with VLE Blackboard tools was lesser. But at the end of the day, flipping takes time to prepare. It takes time to edit videos. It takes time to select, sequence, prepare content. You face similar resistances around, well, I can't possibly pick one thing. Everything that I do in my lecture time is important. They need to know all of it. And the answer is yes, but also, do you expect a student to have an encyclopedic knowledge of the level of you as an expert whenever they come to your session? Or what bits of your content do you sequence? What are the key ideas that they must go away from this teaching event knowing more about? The question about whether or not flipping discourages students from coming to lectures, again, a common concern in a COVID era. If we record materials, where's the incentive for students to come to sessions? And again, that goes back to that point of, well, it's not just what they're doing, but what are you expecting them to do with it? How do you hook them in? How do you check that they're engaging? How do you bring them? How do you know that they have done the reading in old school jargon? And one of the other reasons for resistance that does occasionally come up is that from colleagues who would say that they're already very interactive in their sessions, they talk and students listen, and that's already an interactive process. And that's perhaps a different set of challenges than flipping, but it does come up as one of the reasons to think through. From a student's perspective, they can also be resistant to engaging in flipping. At the end of the day, flipping is a new mode of teaching and learning, or certainly was prior to COVID. It's something that might be familiar to students who have taken courses or programs online, but it takes time to get used to. It's a different way of thinking and doing things. And it makes it much more difficult in a flipped model designed well for students to panic read or panic watch or engage with something in the half hour before the lecture or the half hour before the tutorial. Effective planning and effective flipping makes students prepare in advance in a way that they are ready to do something with the class, in the class. And that is very closely linked to the second point for resistance. It's so much more work. And the answer is probably yes. For students, it can feel like much more work, because in a flipped model, what they are being asked to do is to do some of the work that otherwise, some of the heavy lifting that the academic might otherwise be doing in their session. But again, the question comes down to, if you as the academic already know the information, okay, fine, but how are your students supposed to learn it? Who should be doing more of the work to learn the concept in your sessions? And the last point, again, it's you come to lectures to listen to an expert, not to talk to other students. And this, I think, is a real kind of indicator of how we view teaching and learning in higher education generally, because we're very used to that model of students come, sit in silence, listen to an expert speak for 45 minutes to maybe 2 hours. They scribble notes and they go away. They may or may not interact with each other. And it once again comes back to, how do you conceive learning taking place? And the research evidence and the very extensive body of research suggests that you learn through interacting. You consolidate information through talking it to, doing something with it. The social constructivist mode of learning is the one that is usually most effective in institutions. So if you are thinking about flipping, what it really means is you move from using your lecture time for information transmission to viewing your lecture space as the place for consolidation of that information. In terms of how this works in practice, and I'm keeping a close eye on time here, there's a few key steps to really think through. First up, and again, this is really pertinent to COVID teaching, if you have limited live interactive time with your students, what is the most useful or effective use of that time? Is it to sit silently on a Zoom call and maybe not be engaged, not listen, wander off, do something else? The lecturer is still talking away when you come back with more coffee. Is that the most effective use of what time you have with students? If it's not, maybe you could think about why that is. So anything that is predominantly information transmission is better, quite often better suited for the flip. Thinking about how you select and sequence it, what are the must-knows for a student of any given session? What is to be flipped? So do you expect students to watch a video and make notes, read a journal article and mark them up, write questions that you can bring for discussion in small group teaching based on what they have seen or read or done in advance? And last, and certainly not least, it's think actively planning how you're going to incentivize this engagement with the flip. How do you incentivize students to do it? So if they do it at all, how can you build on that? How can you address that? And how can you be certain or have some concept of where the sticking points for students are that they will benefit from your expertise in helping them acquire that and sort that information faster? I'm just going to very briefly sketch out a case study of how this looks in action, and I'm going to zoom that in because I think that's probably maybe a little bit small to see in your screen. As always, it's slightly better with PowerPoint, but with Zoom, you're better with PDF slides. Hopefully that's a little bit better. And this is a case study from a module that I coordinate and teach on as part of what's called our special purpose certificate in academic practice. So it's an introduction to teaching and learning focused predominantly at early career academics. And one of the kind of key areas that we expect all academics to develop insight and capacity in is in the use of assessment. So there's a week-long theme with lots of kind of theory around the principles and use of assessment in academic practice. What does it look like? Here's the theory, here's the reality. Where do you cite yourself in between them? And really thinking through what you do. As part of that, from COVID, we moved it online. Of course, like everyone else, all of our teaching is online at the moment. So what we really wanted to do, we have roughly 2 hours maximum of live time with our academics in the virtual classroom. What we really wanted to do was to promote as much interactivity as possible, because like for most academics, your capacity to read in your own disciplinary areas of interest is endless. Could you care less about someone else's research? Probably not, whenever it goes into it in detail. For many of our academics, education is a new discipline or a new area for them. And really what we want to do is to tease out the concept and get them to think through, examine their own biases and think through what works and why. As part of that, what we ask them to do, we presented a couple of papers in advance, and in the middle piece here, which I realize is probably a little bit hard to read, there we go. We presented information to them, and we asked them in advance to identify 2 or 3 tasks that they use in the program that they teach on, think about why they use them and why they like using them, and thinking again about whether or not they're fit for practice. Are they appropriate for use in your teaching context? And kind of to pull some information about that, extract their ideas in writing on the discussion board, which we then take up. Some of it we amplify back to them, and some of it we use to inform. And again, I'm just going to highlight that, which again we use to use within the classroom limited time that we have. So what does that look like whenever you move it on? It means that from our discussion boards, we bring up the points about what people were asking them to do, talking through, using those as prompts for interactivity, amplifying, picking up bits that work, areas that don't, and trying to really talk through and get to for academics and for colleagues and for students to identify the why did they do this. And similarly, building on that information, encouraging them to capture from the pre-task, from that flip and discussion of a journal article, what were their key takeaways? And what's the benefit of this? Firstly, it shows that you are incentivizing engagement, that you can hone in. You can see, even in an online mode, you can see where the areas of misunderstanding are with the content that's presented. You can then address that very quickly and easily in open discussion and correct everyone. That guide of moving people to where you think, you probably know as an academic where they need to get to. They may not. Looking at information like this gives you a bigger sense of engagement of how you can move them that way. And it also lets you really highlight things that they've engaged with that are new experiences that are important for other people to think through. Again, back to that interactivity, even in largest group teaching. They're interacting with each other, they're seeing each other's ideas, and they're being able to do this in a way that is all linked. But for it to work, it needs to be thought about at the curriculum design level. I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to give you 23 minutes past. If you've any questions, if you want to scribble them down, and I'm going to hand over to Kevin in just about another minute. As I said, we're going to have a room for, we're going to have a point for an open Q&A forum after we've both spoken. And if anyone's being snotty, yes, this is also a flip. What we're asking you to do is think about what you're doing, and then we'll revisit the questions later in the session. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Jonny. So I'm just going to share my own screen here and just give people another second or two to have a look at the on-screen text. Okay, perfect. So Jonny has talked to the flipped classroom model, and I'm going to look specifically in the context of our own module that we run on technology and learning, and the kind of advantages of the flipped classroom approach in that context. So I teach a module with some of my colleagues called Technology and Learning in Higher Education. And over the last few years, we've also flipped that module itself. So I'm going to start with giving you some of the background and context, then have a look at the module itself, and then focus down on an example class that we teach, and kind of talk through the different elements of that, how we flip the class and get staff to think about flipping their own content as well. So Jonny's talked through the model, and I don't want to go through all that again, but I think particularly in the context of technology and learning, the flipped classroom model is very useful because it's very scalable. So what you often find when you're teaching staff about technology is that you might do a class on blogs, for example, but some of the staff aren't using blogs, and some you know, aren't familiar with them, and it can be very difficult that way. But with the flipped classroom model, what you have is a model where most staff can think of a class that they can flip, and so they can pick one class if they're a new academic. Some academics might think to flip an entire module, some might think to flip an entire course. So you can have everyone engaging in the same concept, but with a different level of what they're hoping to achieve coming out of that. And that core concept, what I want to get them to is thinking about a class that they're going to flip, thinking about what kind of pre-class activity they're going to create. In my context, it's mostly around video content because we're trying to give them those skills around creating videos, and then really thinking about how is that going to open up that in-class time. So there's an issue with existing professional development approaches, and that is that a lot of them tend to look like this, where you got people in a row of computers, and it's not that interactive and engaging. There's not that much chance for people to actually engage with each other, and it's a very kind of didactic approach. And as you can see on the quote there, you know, staff are sat down, they're told, press this button, you'll get this response, and it's not really mind-changing if you're trying to develop a change in practice. So in the module we developed then, we wanted to have that where they would watch pre-class material, again, about videos around 10 minutes in length, then come to class and engage in some active learning with each other and give themselves a chance to engage in group work and actually come out of that having created an artifact of some kind that they could then use to then develop their own content in their own teaching practice. And we also gave them consultancies where they could come along and talk to us and think through what they're going to teach, or maybe a specific class that they're going to change. So just to have an overview of this module, this is a 5-credit module for staff on our special purpose search and academic practice. And I teach it with 3 other people over the years, Tim, David, and Julie. So it was developed obviously pre-COVID. And I'm, I suppose, more optimistic that it could be run again post-COVID, maybe towards the end of next year. But the ideas coming out of it have also been useful in the current context. So just to give you a brief overview, it's aimed at teaching staff who wish to explore the meaningful integration of technology in their teaching practice. Participants will develop the knowledge and skills required to integrate technology and learning activities in their own practice using blended learning, in our case via Blackboard. And like I said, there's a focus on guiding participants in the use of the flipped classroom approach, whereby students engage with online materials such as videos and readings before participating in online and in-class activities. And one of the advantages of that as well is that they get a chance to actually be students in that approach, so they can see the advantages of flipping by being students when watching pre-class material themselves. So I won't go through the whole module structure, but essentially it takes place over the course of about 8 weeks, and we move through the different elements of the flipped classroom. So what I like to do is at the very start, give them a very clear focus about what the classes are about and what the expectations are about the pre-class activity and the in-class activity. So you can see there we move from the online environment to teaching and learning content, i.e. creating video. We look at communication and collaboration, blogs, reflective journals, and so on. Active learning in the classroom, looking at things like in-class polling, then online assessment, and in conclusion and evaluation. And you can see we've got those consultancies as well mixed through that module. So we might have around 15, 16 or so staff taking part in the module at any one time. So I just wanted to pick out one class as an example because this is the kind of cornerstone, I suppose. If they create this video content, it kind of opens up what they can do in the flipped classroom approach. So what we do is I get them to watch a video on video design, and then in class they work in groups, create a video themselves, in our case using Panopto, which is our lecture capture software, but obviously there's a few different options out there. And again, I really want them to go away having created some video themselves that they can then use in their own teaching practice. Even if it's only one thing, it's what we say to them, you know, you might do this whole module and only come away with creating one video, but that's the kind of basis over which over time you can iterate and develop more and more technology and learning activities. So this is how we set up the room when they come to class. So we have the instructor desk essentially in an active learning design. So it's kind of a horseshoe shape where each table has a computer and they work in groups of 4 or 5. Again, hopefully by September next year, this will be more normal again. And they have a PC, they have a microphone, and they have a lot of different material in front of them to help them get up and running with the particular task for the week. So to have a look at that class on creating video content as an example. So what I do is straight away, we make it clear to them what the class is going to be about. So when they come in the door, they've watched a 10-minute video, which I'll just alt-tab here and show you. So I have this 10-minute video, and it basically goes through some of the different instructional design elements of creating video. A lot of the elements that Jonny was talking to about chunking content. There's also practical tips, things people often ask, where do I source images, around copyright and so on. And then we also look at some different content creation tools that are available. So hopefully they've watched that, or most of them have watched it. And an advantage as well, if having them working in groups, is if someone hasn't watched in the group, there'll always be someone in the group who will kind of help to explain it and help to get them up to speed quickly as well. So they come in class then and they have that on screen. They're going to work in teams, create a brief video, giving an overview of a social learning tool for a flipped classroom. So they have their pre-class activity that they've watched already, hopefully, and then they're going to come to class and actually investigate the technology and create a sample video themselves. So what I like to do is have this up as a kind of warm-up activity, discuss how they might currently use or potentially use the flipped classroom approach in their own teaching. They come up with a team name together and they write their team name on a sheet and some examples of how they might use that approach. And one thing I found really useful is in PowerPoint, you can actually embed videos from YouTube. And what I do is I embed 10-minute timer videos from YouTube. So I actually put those up there and click play, and it will actually count down in the slide. It will play a noise once it's finished counting down. And that's a really useful way for these group activities in a flipped classroom to help keep people on task. They're not wondering how much time is left and so on. So I keep that slide up all the time during any activity that I'm running. So as a kind of warm up, we get them to think about, well, what are some of the instructional videos you might have watched yourself, whether you're trying to fix your sink, fix your phone if it fell in the sink, budget for a new phone, learn to use Excel, these kind of things. Think of some of the videos you've watched on YouTube already. And then we get them to go to a Google Doc on each team and brainstorm, well, what are the qualities of a good instructional or educational video that you might think of from YouTube? And what we tend to find is that a lot of people, and you kind of intuitively know what makes for a good video. You know, it's things like good sound quality, a nice structure, it's not overly long, it's not overly technical in its phrasing and so on. And get them to think about that, and that's the kind of warm-up activity that they use to kind of think about their own teaching, the videos they might create. So some of the stuff that comes up out of that we give them as advice, one thing I always say to them, it's not a mystery novel, so have a clear intro and outro. So You don't need to leave them in suspense about what the video is about. At the very start, we always say, tell them what you're going to cover. And then at the end of the video, say, as we've covered in this video, X, Y, Z. The other thing is that it's not a Hollywood production and it doesn't have to be perfect. A lot of people get very caught up in making the video perfect and they spend too much time re-recording stuff. So I always say to them, look, if you make a mistake, you can leave it in or just leave a slight pause and you can edit it out later. You don't have to go back and recreate the whole thing from scratch. And then other idea of breaking it into 10-minute chunks, because we do find that it can take students 2 or 3 times longer to watch a video than the length itself, because they're pausing it, they're going back, they're taking notes. So one 10-minute video might be more than sufficient, rather than creating one big 50-minute thing that takes students way too long and they're less likely to watch. Other tip I'd have for people is to make it easy to reuse the video each year. So avoid things like, as we'll cover in Tuesday's class, because when you run the module next year, that class is going to be on Wednesday, or the timetable changes, or even things like don't refer to the module name or code in the video, because as you know, in a university, these things can change and so on each year. So have it on a discrete topic that you can then build up a bank of these videos over time. The other thing I do is I ask them to think about developing a bullet point script. So rather than spending hours trying to script it out exactly, because you're never going to talk exactly as you write on a sheet of paper, develop a bullet point script. It helps to structure the video, but it also gives you that free form to be more interactive in what you're saying and not kind of looking down at a piece of paper the whole time. And that's what I do in these sessions as well. Just try and have a little bullet point script to keep a general structure going. And then that idea of really pick a class to start with that you're going to develop, because you might have your whole module, but then you might have an individual class that is really kind of key, or a good example that could be flipped. Think about your video and then think about your in-class activities. And one thing I'm always keen on is that staff don't set themselves too much. So I don't want them flipping a whole module or course if they're new to this. Just pick one class. You can flip it this year, pick another, and then over time you build up a bank of video material that you can reuse. So after they've had that warm-up activities, we get them to create a video. So they have about 60 minutes to do this. They have to create a short video combining PowerPoint with audio narration using Panopto in our case, which again, there's other tools out there. So they need to investigate the tool, prototype it, and work together to figure out how it works. So each team has a computer with Panopto, a test Blackboard module, and some sample PowerPoint files. So they need to access the slides and Blackboard on their computer, use Panopto, edit the video. And what I do then is I take those videos they've created and I add them to the Blackboard module that we teach on. So it's a chance for them to actually watch what other groups have created and have something meaningful as a first step in doing that. So each team has a setup like that. And you can see there, they have an Panopto, they have a microphone. Now you can just use a headset like I'm doing. You don't have to buy expensive equipment. But essentially they go in and I basically give them very few instructions, maybe a little cheat sheet or something like that. I want them to figure out how Panopto works. And again, going back to that earlier slide, you know, a lot of times when you're teaching about technology, people expect to be shown exactly what button to press. But the idea here is I want them to explore it and figure it out themselves. And what you find is for the first 5 or 10 minutes, they're a bit unsure what to do. And after that, they get it. They've created this basic video and I'm going around the class monitoring them. And that just helps them to kind of figure out, hey, I can figure out this myself. There's not as much to it as I thought. So what happens then, each group has created their video. So I'll give one group a script about blogs, another one about journals, forums, and so on. And like I say, I'll take those videos, I'll upload them to the module that we're running, and then the different teams can actually go in and watch those, because the next class then we run is on blogs, journals, forums, and social learning tools. So what I asked them to was I have another presentation then for the next class, similar to this. They watch that, but they can also watch what the other groups have created and post any queries on the discussion board. And then at the end, I get them to reflect, well, what did you learn? Where are the challenges? Think about your own plans for teaching. And again, that just always emphasizing start small and build up from there. So just on the final slide here, and we'll pass over then to the kind of reflection then. The idea is then to make the learning as authentic as possible through realistic activities. So I want them to create a video that they in their head as they're making it, they're thinking, actually other teams in this room might actually watch this. And what I find is I get them to use that team name so they don't feel too exposed. You know, this is a video created by team X or team Y. rather than me posting this video on my own. And then I provide a space for learners to experiment in that kind of active learning approach and give them a sense of accomplishment from having created something. What I really enjoy about it is that a lot of them have never created a video when they come to class, and then after 20, 30 minutes, they have all these ideas about what they might do, and just give them that bit of confidence in kind of demystifying some of the aspects of creating video content. So again, if you have any questions, please feel free to make a note of them, and we'll move on then to the reflection. Jonny, if you want to come to your slides.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Kevin. Thank you. So I'm just going to go back first. Before we go into our reflection, can I ask, how comfortable are you after that with the kind of the idea or the concept of using a flipped classroom in your own context? And again, if you can just stick numbers in, that would be really helpful, just to get a sense of it. Okay. Okay, super. That's quite interesting to see. You'll notice that from peer pressure, I think that's a good point. And I wouldn't normally advocate for doing it in the chat box. I am less familiar with the use of Zoom than I am with some of the other kind of teaching tools. I would much rather do this anonymously than be able to identify who's where. If you set it up as a poll and show it in live time, you get more honest answers. Kevin, in terms of talking about our key learnings, do you maybe want to kick off and then maybe kind of your final points?
Yeah, sure. So I think I kind of covered some of it a bit, but it's that idea that for a lot of staff, particularly pre-COVID, the idea of making videos was quite a remote topic. And I do always like, of all the classes I teach, this is probably my favorite because, again, particularly with the improvements we see to a lot of the technology around creating video content, you know, people no longer need things like Adobe or some of these more expensive things, and getting them to creating their first video, and then maybe coming back and meeting them a few months later and seeing the pride, I suppose, they've taken in creating their videos is great, and seeing how they over time develop up that bank of videos and hopefully becomes part of their teaching practice. And I really do think the flipped classroom is a great inroad for new academics in that sense, because like I said earlier, it's scalable. So they can pick something really small and just do one class and have that inroad into that wider space of technology and learning, rather than biting off some big topic like blogs or discussion boards and so on. And really using that then to open up their class time and hopefully see the advantages of that as they develop and think about technology in their teaching over time.
Thanks, Kevin. So I think mine are probably fairly similar. And I think it comes back to scalability as well as interactivity. One of the key challenges that I think many colleagues, particularly, and again, those colleagues who are new to teaching and learning, it's an unholy amount of stress to be standing at the front of a lecture for 2 hours, trying to hold the attention of every single person in the room for 2 hours completely. One of the things that flipping does is open up that mindset of who's doing the work in the session, and that it lets academics pass some of that workload over to students. It's not saying that they're not involved. They very much have a role as kind of as leading learning, but it's not all about them, and flipping facilitates that mindset change. And I suppose really whenever my key points are to keep it short, keep it focused, be very explicit. What do you expect people to do with it? Why should they bother? And also from personal experience at this stage, script and or storyboard what you want to do. It's much, much less hassle to think it through and prepare it than it is to mess about editing with a very, very fiddly editing. I am far from technologically gifted, as you have probably noticed from my consistent being of mute and inability to share screens swiftly and efficiently. The same applies when it comes to video editing. So it's much easier to edit, to prepare and script and edit less. Just to touch in a couple of the questions. One of them was around kind of the use of formative assessment techniques, things like that poll that I ran in the chat. If you're using a VLE tool, you can actually run that very, very visually, quickly, effortlessly with short props for polling. The idea is that you're using it as a check-in. You're kind of really taking the pulse. Where are students with the concept that you're understanding at that time? What are they struggling with? Are they with you? are they still awake? And kind of punctuating a session with formative assessment techniques brings them with you. They're more likely to stay involved. It's again goes back to that idea, you might see it of active learning. Who's doing what in a session? An interactive session is one that engages students, and an interactive does not mean you talk and they listen. It also kind of lets you put a focus on what process is. Learning isn't fixed. You learn something, and then you might learn how to do something else with it again. And it can do a lot to enhance that connection, that interactivity between you and students in an online environment as well. Excuse me as I mute all of the things binging at me. A couple of other examples for them. A lot of this comes from Angelo and Patricia Cross. It's not a new concept. You hear them referred to as CATS, classroom assessment techniques, assessment for learning, AFL techniques, and there's various examples of them. A background knowledge probe is the kind of thing that I did just to get a sense of where people are with the concept before you go into it in detail. A minute paper might be summarize the content of this lecture in 3 sentences, so that you try to get the sense of what the key takeaways that students have from that session. And that can be shared back in a remote environment. That can be shared back to you as a word cloud, for example. A muddiest point question is again, and you can do this online visually, which makes it really impactful. What's the piece that's most confusing? What's the least clear in today's session? Concept maps is when you try and get them to draw, connect kind of ideas together. The polling is what we're talking about. And the idea of 3-2-1 structured reading is the one that I demonstrated from perspectives, where you ask them to have 3 key takeaways, 2 problems, and maybe 1 thing that they want to go and find out more about. But that's really neatly addressed. If you want to Google it, we have some resources on this. They probably need updated. I think the best web resource on this in terms of usability is probably from Vanderbilt University. And if you Google classroom assessment techniques, Vanderbilt, you should be able to find the Vanderbilt CTL page, who goes through it in detail. And the reason that there says poll, I can see where these would be easily integrated into my teaching, is that I pulled these slides from a different training session to make them visible to you. I'm not going to inflict a poll on you at that point, but that would be kind of one way to think through those kind of interactive activities.